Back to Parsons. The class is thrilled. I know it's been an agonizing 48 hours that you've had to wait. We're getting back to the concepts of Parsons. All right. Just want to make sure my mic is working. That sounds a little bit better there. Okay. All right. So as I was saying, we need to finish up Parsons. A few more slides on Parsons. A few important concepts yet to discuss. Complementarity of expectations is something we want to briefly discuss. Pattern variables, which unsurprisingly most students are confused about. And then we'll end with his Agile scheme, which is an acronym for four functional imperatives that must be met for the survival of any group or society. So let's get through those things, and then we'll move on to Robert Merton. We'll move on to our second functionalist. So again, to continue with our conversation, which we started on Tuesday, structural functionalists are primarily concerned with the phenomenon of social order and how social order is achieved. Social order is achieved through the maintenance of social solidarity. So the way that structural functions view societies is that societies are composed of parts, and each of those parts, all the way down to the roles, right, from institutions down to the roles that constitute those institutions, that all the elements of the system are to be assessed in terms of their contribution to the maintenance of the system as a whole. So it's an important question then for our functionalists. How is social stability routinely achieved? Once again, their interest is in explaining the conservation of society. Critical theorists, which we'll discuss next week, conflict theorists are interested in the opposite phenomenon, which is what is it that leads to the dissolution of societies? What leads to the breakdown of societies? Functionalists are interested in what is it that helps maintain a society so that it is continuing, right? It continues, it perseveres as a society. For partisan, social order is made possible by a series of complex processes of social coordination. So how well, and he gets this idea from Durkheim. Durkheim discussed, if you may recall, from your 101 class. I know it's something that I take time to discuss in 101. The division of labor in its normal form, when it's a healthy division of labor, leads to a state of mutual interdependence, right? And that's an important source of social solidarity, Durkheim tells us, in modern organic societies. One form of a deviant or abnormal form of division of labor is when it becomes anomic and when there's a breakdown in coordination between the elements that constitute the division of labor. So the emphasis is going all the way back to Durkheim. What is it that maintains social order? It's in part through social coordination. A well-synchronized, a well-coordinated society will produce social order. And then that also depends on achieving, and this is an important argument that Parsons makes, achieving a state of cultural consensus. When members of a group reach a consensus, that means they reach an agreement. And agreement is the opposite of disagreement. So when individuals in a society, groups in a society are unable to achieve cultural consensus, unable to achieve agreement, that means they find themselves in a situation of disagreement. And that's where we find discord. That's where we find agitation. That's where we find the breakdown, potentially the breakdown of the society itself. So Parsons places enormous weight and significance on social consensus for maintaining society by producing social solidarity. Again, this idea is drawn from Durkheim, who would use the term in the place of cultural consensus, the collective consciousness. The collective consciousness is the consensus of a society. Right? The values, the beliefs, the norms that are shared in common with the average member of a society. So how do we achieve social stability, social order in our society? Through arriving at cultural consensus, arriving at a state of agreement. So his argument is that a fit must be achieved between the needs of the individual and the requirements of institutions. The needs of individuals continue to change, continue to evolve. What individuals feel they need to be happy today is different than what individuals felt they needed to be happy 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 150 years ago. That's because expectations that people have continue to change over time. Your expectations are part informed by your generation, or maybe for the most part informed by your generation. But your generation's expectations are different than my generation's expectations, or the expectations, say, of the baby boomers. I've come across some interesting articles in the Wall Street Journal which pertain to some types of strain between the expectations of new hires that are part of Gen Z and the bosses, the CEOs, the board of directors that run the business. So they have to work out somehow a new consensus, a new arrangement, a new agreement as to what the firm, the organization, the business of the corporation owes to their workers. And then in turn, what the workers own or owe their employers, right? So it's establishing a fit, a complementarity of expectations between this new generation of workers and the old generation of workers that, for the most part, own and run the businesses. So a complementarity of expectations. This is a really important idea for Parsons, and again, it's derivative, it's derived from the work of Emile Durkheim. It's a very simple concept, and the word expectation, of course, we use in everyday vernacular. It's not that you have to be a sociologist to discuss, to understand, to comprehend expectation, to discuss the importance of expectation. But in many ways, when we're discussing, going back to the Unit Act, what is the Unit Act, right? It's composed of those four universal elements. One important element is normative regulation. What is it then? What's another way of thinking of normative regulation, to say that all action is normatively regulated? It means that there will always be, insofar as the action, social action, that is to say it involves other people, you will always have to meet the expectations of the people that you're interacting with and you have relationships with. So the expectations, in many ways, they are the norms. That is one way of thinking of, if you just look up on your computer, for example, Oxford English Dictionary, and you type in norm, what do you find? Behavioral expectations. Expectations are norms, and another way of thinking about norms is that they are the rules. The rules of an institution, the rules of an organization, say the rules of the primary group, say in a household dwelling. Order and stability are indicative of complementary systems. That continuity exists as a result of shared expectations regarding roles and goals. So a lot of these articles in the Wall Street Journal that I'm reading about is because this new generation of worker shows up. They're 22, 23 years old, and they have very different expectations of what their employers owe them compared to, say, the expectations of those that are part of even millennials or Gen Z or the baby boomers. One article that I came across, this is, of course, referring to one particular firm, and it was a finance firm. But what the workers wanted from the employer was an in-house therapist. An in-house therapist, meaning there is going to be a person, a therapist, a counselor, hired by the company who's going to have their own office off the hall, and that the workers can sign up for counseling, once or twice a week, or whatever sort of the therapist or counselor is able to maintain. Right? But that's a different that's a new expectation among your generation and past expectations. Now, there's been the expectation for, say, forms of health insurance that could cover mental health services, that sort of thing. But it's becoming more of an expectation among your generation that there will be an in-house therapist. So somebody that works for the company that then you don't have to leave work to go to, but you could take a half hour out of your day to talk to. Right? It's a constant state of change. Structural functionalists are aware of this. But we can achieve consensus. Agreement can always be reached. Compromise for the functionalists can always be met as long as participating parties are willing to negotiate. Right? Again, it's like a marriage or democracy. Right? The health of the democracy, the health of the marriage depend on reaching consensus. How do you get there? Through negotiation. And it means that you're never going to get everything you want. But you should get some of what you want. And they're never going to get everything they want, but they're going to get some of what they want. Consensus is achieved through the processes of socialization, through internalization and institutionalization. So it's through these processes then individuals and institutions can arrive at a state of consensus, arrive at a state of complementarity. So it reminds me of during the pandemic where we suddenly, March of 2020, we're being instructed to stay home, and suddenly students are emailing me saying, what are we doing? I mean, as we're wrapping up the end of winter quarter, and then when we started spring quarter, it was entirely online. And one of the primary concerns the students had is, what is expected of us? What are the expectations of the course now that we're online? How are we going to make it? Because student assessment is based on performance. So if you know your performance is going to be assessed, you want to know, well, what are the expectations? In what way will I be assessed? So having similar expectations, shared expectations, means I know what to expect of you, and you know what to expect of me. So you've spent your whole lives, for the most part, as students. And I've spent a fair amount of my life as an instructor. So we both show up in this social scene or social setting within the institution of higher education, and we have expectations of one another that are a near match. So you do the things that I expect you to do, and I do the things that you expect me to do, and we get along very well, as long as we share the same expectations. But when those expectations break down, that's when one or more parties sense an imbalance and say, wait a minute, I'm not getting out of this arrangement, I'm not getting out of this exchange what I hope to get out of it. And that leads to discontentment among the parties that are interacting with one another. When socialization is successful, internalization occurs. Cultural meanings are absorbed through the process of socialization. You should know what this concept means by now. It simply means learning. Socialization involves a process of learning, acquiring the culture of one's society. Through the process of socialization, if it's successful, then the cultural meanings of a society become part of who you are. They define your sense of self. Cultural meanings become part of the self. That is to say, the beliefs, the values, and norms are adopted as one's own. That's what it means to internalize a value. So all values, as Durkheim would say, all beliefs or all values or all norms exist externally when we enter into the world. None of us bring values, beliefs, or norms into the world. That's because we don't have the cognitive capacity or capability to do that. We're infants. Our minds barely function. It's going to take years and years and years and years to even be able to think abstractly and grasp the concept of a belief, a value, or a norm. So no one enters the world with any sense of normative order in their mind or any sense of value or belief. But over time, we acquire it through the process of socialization. And all those values and all those beliefs and all those norms that were at once external to us become internal. And we adopt them as our own. And we say, oh, but of course we believe in the legitimacy of the republic and democracy. Of course we do. That, of course, is arrived at after years and years of socialization. To then internalize that belief that the most legitimate form of political organization is a representative democracy. But that's not an idea that anybody is born with. Institutionalization is a parallel process of culture becoming part of the institutional order. So we're all, as we get to Alfred Schutz and we get to Berger and Luckman, their argument is that we're born into a predefined reality. We're all born into an already established institutional order. And it becomes our job, through the process of socialization, to learn what that order is. To learn what the cultural values, beliefs, and norms are. To learn, to put it simply, what are the rules of the game? And there are many games that we play, but whatever game that we're playing, what are the rules of that game? How should that game be played? That involves the socialization, the internalization of the institutional order. For Parsons, we have a nice, when all these things align, when there aren't too many generational divides and gaps, and we share a general understanding with one another, a consensus, we share for the most part 85-90% of cultural expectations, we can get along rather well. But when that set of expectations breaks down, that's when people become very unhappy and they become very frustrated because they expect to get something that they're not getting. So workers, your generation of workers, are expecting more and more from your employers. You want more and more. So much so that 50 years ago, those workers would say, that's unreasonable. What you're asking for is unreasonable. In fact, a number of CEOs are saying, these are unreasonable requests. But for your generation, you might say they're not unreasonable at all. But attitudes change over time. Right? They change over time. They change based on life experience. And your life experience in your generation is different from the generations that came before you. You take certain things for granted that past generations couldn't take for granted. So you come to expect other things. Ideally, these processes, these three processes, they serve social integration, which, as we were talking about on Tuesday, should be the primary concern of the sociologist. The professional sociologist, in Parsons' mind, has the enormous responsibility of managing the affairs of society, making sure that we achieve a strong degree of social order, social stability, and that we have the right mechanisms in place in order to arrive at a consensus and maintain consensus. And this is also an important idea that will be revisited next Thursday when we discuss the work of Jürgen Habermas, who's part of the Frankfurt School. He very much agrees with Durkheim and Parsons that you have to achieve consensus. Members of a society have to come to an agreement if they are to get along in an orderly fashion. The very notion of action systems suggests that systems are never completely stable, that action itself is a disrupting factor because it involves change. So all systems, Parsons tell us, must adapt to an ever-changing environment. And our environment, as I'm talking about in my Sociology 101 class, and we're discussing Marx and Engels and the rise of modern capitalism, that institution, that form of economic organization is behind much of the rapid pace of change in today's world because of competition within our economic system that drives companies to invent and to innovate. And that means constant change. Social systems are continually in flux, they acknowledge, adjusting and changing as a result of environmental conditions. So the job of the sociologist would be a continual process of managing discrepancies, managing dysfunctions in society, managing conflicts. Now this would be a part of one of the strengths of a democratic order through a representative democracy, through, say, populism in a positive sense, is that representatives are mindful, aware, cognizant of the concerns, the wants, desires, and needs of the population. And they change policy accordingly. Right? The idea is democracy is designed to be adaptive and change as the population changes. So we have some institutions that are designed quite well to absorb change. So when attitudes change over time, those attitudes are expressed to representatives, and those representatives see that legislation is changed in such a way where there exists a complementarity between the legislation and the attitudes of people. Conflict occurs due to a divergence in expectations or shared understandings amongst actors. So, for example, we can look at this, Parsons would say, it's that all of these things have to do with simply the dynamics of groups. So we could talk about the dynamics of families, and we could talk about the dynamics of political institutions. But for Parsons, a group is a group. It's going to vary in terms of the number of people, in terms of the complexity, and it's harder to keep, say, 340 million people happy than it is to say a nuclear family of 4. But the dynamics, you would say, are roughly the same. So here we have, say, a divergence in expectations with a teenager and now, again, the social construction of childhood, the social construction of adolescence, the social construction of the teenager years. There hasn't always been a childhood. There hasn't always been a period of adolescence. There hasn't always been, right, the teenager. But we have, that is something of an institution that exists today. The teenagers get to a certain age and they expect some autonomy, and they expect some independence from their parents, and they expect that the rules of the household will be designed in such a way that provides them autonomy and provides them some measure of independence, such as the freedom to spend time with friends as they choose. Because as we all know, during that stage of the teenage years, the importance of the primary group is of great significance. Your peers are arguably the most important people in your life, and you're far more likely to listen to your peers than your parents. So the expectation is that they sort of give you a little bit more rope, extend the leash a little bit, so you have a little bit more autonomy and you have a little bit more independence. But maybe with a family that's very strict, they don't want to give that teenager the independence that they want. That can lead to, again, a divergence of expectations And because of differing expectations between the parents and the teenager, they're at odds. And every single night at dinner, they're having an argument about the teenager is protesting and saying this household is too strict, and everybody else's parents let their friends go out and spend time together, and here they're left out, and they don't get to spend enough time with their friends, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is a consequence of an imbalance between expectations within the household. So what would have to happen? Parsons would say, you've got to reach a new consensus. Those individuals within that family have to reach a new consensus. A new consensus must be reached that meets the needs of the teenager and the demands of the family. So the teenagers need this position, right? That exists within the personality system. The personality, so we have the social system, the cultural system, the personality system. So the teenagers need it, meaning they need what? In order to be happy, in order to be gratified, they need to spend more time with their friends. For this teenager, that's what that teenager needs, more time spent with friends. But then the family is saying, well, but you have obligations as being part of this family, and you have chores to do, and we expect also that you spend time with us. So there becomes then a conflict between the need dispositions of the teenager and that teenager's role obligations to the family. What's the way out of this? Instead of perpetual fights at the dinner table, it's forming a new consensus, where these parties have to enter into a process of negotiation and come to some agreement. Okay, all right, we'll give you 1 day a week for 3 hours. And maybe that's enough to placate the teenager. Doubtful, but maybe. Okay. So, and this is important because we will be spending more time talking about the importance of consensus. In the origin of that idea, Durkheim, Parson, and then later on we're going to be discussing the significance for Habermas, its significance for Alfred Schutz, and its significance for Berger and Luckman as well. They use a different term, they use the term intersubjectivity, but it's basically the same idea as consensus. So it is an important current of thought within sociological theory. Okay, so pattern variables as dilemmas of orientation. Now this is a concept that often throws students off. What is meant by pattern variables? Well, let's sort of break it down into its component parts. What is a variable? A variable is a unit of data that takes on at least 2 qualities or more. Right? A variable. Variables are important in scientific research. A variable is any unit of data that takes on the 2 or more values, we can say. 2 or more values. So some important sociological variables would be, say, gender. Male or female, and what have you. Race. You could talk about race as a variable as well. Right? Asian American, African American, European American, Hispanic American. These are all different variables that relate to race because racial identity takes on different values. Right? Or we can talk about it in terms of class. Right? Different variables of class would include working class, middle class, upper class, right? So we're studying the same phenomenon, class, race, gender, but each of those vary in terms of qualities. Pattern, to talk about pattern is structural functionalism. To talk about patterns, then, are to talk about regularities of action. Again, we're born into a social order. And hopefully for most of our lives, things will continue to be orderly. That is to say, behavioral patterns become normalized and regularized. So patterns simply refer to patterned action, regularized action. According to Parsons, any action will involve 5 dichotomous choices. And that's why he calls these pattern variables regularized behavior of some form. It depends, it varies. What that behavior exactly is can be a series of things. Just like class can be different, and racial identity can be different, and gender identity can be different. It can take on different qualities. So he's simply saying that regularized patterns of behavior can take on different qualities. What are these qualities? These qualities have to do with the dilemmas of orientation. For example, to take from your textbook, will this action, when considering this particular action, will this action gratify emotional impulse? That is to say, should this action be emotional, or should this action be one of affective neutrality? That is the absence of emotion. Whose interest will it serve? Will this action serve the interests of the individual, or will it serve the interests of the collectivity? Will it be impersonal? Will it involve achievement as opposed to ascribed status? Or will it be narrowly prescribed? Parsons' argument is that most of this, for us, most of these choices, and this is where we get to structural functionalism and the emphasis they place on structure. To say they emphasize structure is to say they emphasize the rules that organize our social existence. So the rules of any institution basically, for the most part, make decisions for us as to how to act in a particular situation. Many of these choices are made by society in the form of custom, in the form of policy, or in the form of law. And because custom, policy, and law determine action, action becomes regularized. It becomes pattern. Action becomes pattern through tradition, through custom, through policy, through law. All of these customs, all of these policies, all of these laws involve value orientations. The value orientations that are most prevalent within society. Value orientations may be interpreted as imposing a preference to one alternative over another. Value orientations become institutionalized in social systems and internalized in personality systems. So this would be the cultural system, is what presents us with values or ends or objectives that we're expected to be oriented to and to achieve. In line with the work of Tony's, Parsons would say, if we look, here are the 5 pattern variables. And again, these are the dilemmas of orientation that all societies are faced with. In traditional societies, and there can be some exceptions to the rule here, but these are the most salient characteristics of traditional societies: a high degree of affectivity. Traditional societies are also distinguished from modern societies because of a greater emphasis on collective orientation. That's because that's what tradition implies. Tradition implies conformity to the group, which implies a collective orientation. That you're adopting the interests of the group when you're acting as opposed to the interests of the individual. That goes hand in hand with modern societies. Traditional societies tend to be particularistic. They tend to involve ascription and diffuseness. Modern societies, on the other hand, have a high degree, relatively speaking, have a high degree of effective neutrality, particularly within occupations and professions. There's a wonderful, I think it was published in the late 1980s or early 1990s. I assign it pretty regularly in my social psychology class, but it's a co-authored study of medical students and medical students as receiving their training. The expectation is that with time, they'll be able to do their job and do their job more effectively if they eliminate a high degree of emotion, meaning if they achieve a posture of effective neutrality. Right? That the good physician, the good doctor, or the good surgeon is not, say, indifferent to the patient, but has a stance of effective neutrality. So emotional neutrality. You wouldn't want your surgeon to not have effective neutrality as they're cutting you open. Right? So effective neutrality defines modern society. So does self-orientation. That is to say, modern societies are more likely to be individualistic societies. Modern societies also are set apart by universalism as compared to particularism, achievement compared to ascription, and specificity. So, for example, I know all of this is just like, oh my God. Here you go. Here's an easy way, getting to the examples. Hopefully I can make some progress here if I give you an example which you can certainly relate to because you're students yourself. Okay, how should I evaluate how well you do in this class? Or how could I phrase this? How am I as an instructor to assess you in this class? Because at the end of the class, every instructor of record is expected to provide an assessment, an evaluation, and that evaluation takes a grade. Right? Everywhere from like A plus F or whatever it might be. Right? There is a set of rules, institutionalized, that guide the decisions that the instructor makes. And we can see in here 3 of the 5 pattern variables. One important pattern variable, again, what's the opposite of universalism, particularism? Should I assign grades on the basis of how likable I think your personality is? You come to office hours and I go, wow, I really like this person's sense of humor. It's a lot like mine. I think they deserve an A. You say, no, that's not professional. You don't hand out grades on the basis of how well you like a student's personality. Assessment is to be based on universal standards, and you have a copy of those universal standards. They're in the core syllabus. Everyone has the same breakdown. 35% for a midterm, 35% for a final, 30% for discussion section, 10% for attendance and participation, 20% for weekly response postings. It's been universalized. Every student here will be held to the same standards of assessment. It comes down to how well the work is done, the quality of the work itself, and how well you perform on the exams. The point is, what Parsons is saying is it needn't be that way. We could go back to a particular system in the past, and I could just hand out grades not entirely at random, but under very particular circumstances where I say, well, it just comes down to how well I like you. But those aren't the standards that we use in the modern day university. We use universal standards. Priority will be given to standards defined in completely generalized terms. In completely generic terms, the syllabus is a generic document in that sense, meaning not a single student is being named. That's the point, because it's for every student in the class. What about achievement? What's the opposite of achievement? Ascribed identities, say identities that are inherited. So maybe I go, well, I'm going to give A's based on your household income. Let's say you're from an affluent, you were born into an affluent household Your parents have lots of money, consequently, you have large sums of money. And maybe on that basis, then I say, well, you deserve an A. Because you're wealthy, and I'll reward you more. And for those that aren't as wealthy, well, I won't give them as good of grades. That would be the assignment of grades based on an assigned identity, one that is not tied to your individual achievement. It may be your parents' achievement, but it's not your achievement. How well you do in the class will be tied to achievement. Achievement will give priority to the objects, that is, students' actual or expected performances. But once again, it needn't be that way. It could be different, as it has been different in the past. Or specificity. Specificity will be oriented toward a sort of social object only within specific range of relevance. In this case, that involves the capacity of the student. You play many roles in life, and each of those roles can be assessed in terms of your performance. How well are you performing each of those roles? How well are you performing the roles of girlfriend or boyfriend? Or how well are you performing the roles of son and daughter? How well are you performing the role of an employee? I'm not taking into account, other instructors aren't taking into account the performance of other roles that constitute yourself. We're only taking into account how you do on these assignments. That means it's specific. It's not, I'm going to get a call from your parents and they're going to say, oh, this student has been in a foul mood most of the quarter. And then I reduce your grade. It doesn't work that way. It's specific to your performance here in the class. So decisions, in other words, have to be made. How emotional? What degree of emotional neutrality, right? When you go on, say you go, there are different, Hochschild, we'll talk about this in a few weeks when we get to the work of Arlie Hochschild, right? Feeling rules, feeling norms. There are different expectations for expressing emotions given the social situation. At a birthday party, you're supposed to show up with a smile on your face and be happy to be there. You're expected to show emotion in that context. So it's the norm of be happy at a birthday party that directs and organizes your outward behavior, your emotional behavior. But once again, if we go back to the example of the modern day physician, the expectation is that physician has more or less a posture of effective neutrality. There's self-orientation, there's collective orientation, there's universalism, as we were talking about, and particularism. There's ascription and achievement. There's specificity and diffuseness. These are the pattern variables. And individuals in a society have to make decisions as to, say, what are people entitled to? Should somebody be entitled to a driver's license simply on the basis of ascription? That you're 16 years old, we're throwing out the driving test and we're throwing out the written test, and all you have to do is prove that you're 16 years old and you get a license? Because currently we have a system that's both based on ascription, meaning age, and also achievement. You have to be 16 and you have to pass written exams. So I don't know if they still have it for you guys. For me, it did. And then there was the driving exam. So you would get a driver's license if you were 16 years or older, and it was part performance-based. You had to achieve it. Those should be lawfully allowed to consume alcohol. Once again, this decision is made for us by law. Who should lawfully be allowed to consume alcohol? We say anyone who's 21 years or older. I just spent this last weekend in Vegas celebrating my niece's 21st birthday. Ugh, I'm not going back. Too bright, too loud, too crowded, no. My God, and everybody's blasted, drunk. 21 years old. Ascription versus achievement. Legal consumption of alcohol is determined by an ascribed status. Now, it could be, this is the point that Parsons is trying to make, it could be otherwise. It could be otherwise. It could be part performance-based. Prove to us that you're responsible enough to drink. I want to see your track record. Have you been making the right decisions? Maybe there's a probationary period. Ooh, I like that idea. Probationary period. Let's see how well you do with the right to drink. See how well you behave for a year. And if you can't handle your liquor, and you can't handle your alcohol, then we're taking that privilege away from you. That's not really how we do it. Right? It's you're 21 years old. You have now the legal right in this country. You can, of course, younger, you can consume alcohol at a younger age, but it's 21 years old. So that would be an example of an ascribed status. It is based on age, 21 years of age, not on the basis of achievement, not on the basis of performance. But you could create a system in which you somehow take performance into account. We could create such a system. And another example from your textbook involves modern medicine. The relationship between the patient and medical specialist is typically marked by professionalism and affective neutrality rather than affectivity. So the idea is that you have rapport with your physician, but that person is also able to be objective enough with you when giving you sound medical advice. Right? We want some degree of distance. And this, as our reading points out, would contrast with the traditional approach of the shaman who harnesses emotion in the healing process. So it hasn't always been the case that healing has taken the form of modern medicine in which the physician assumes a posture of effective neutrality when working with patients. In the past, it would be mixed in with mysticism and mixed in with a great deal of emotion and, say, purging from the person evil spirits. Okay, so that's on pattern variables. And lastly, we get to the Agile scheme. The Agile scheme, and I just have a couple slides on this. It's pretty self-explanatory. You can simply think of these as functional imperatives. The things that must be achieved for any group if that group is to maintain itself, to persist as a group. So Parson maintains that there are 4 functional imperatives or requirements that are encountered by all action systems, meaning they must be achieved by members of any group. So say from the family as an institution all the way up to, say, the polity, say a political institution, the citizenry. There are 4 basic problems that a society, group, or individual must confront in order to survive, and these are the 4. So this is Agile is an acronym for the following: adaptation, goal attainment, integration, being of utmost importance for the sociologist, and latent pattern changes. In a few minutes, we'll get to a discussion of goal attainment, which factors centrally into Merton's strain theory. Adaptation. Societies must secure material resources for their members. So we could say that is largely the role played by an economic system. As an economic system is continuing to change as the technologies of production change, to produce, to adapt to the physical environment, to produce the necessities of life. Societies must also create goals and opportunities for their members. What are the things that we're expected to achieve? Right? We all have some sense of what a successful life means. And we all have a sense that society has said, in some general way, these are some of the ideals of success, or these are some of the goals of success. What are we to do? I mean, human action is purposeful. What ends or what goals should we be oriented to? What are the things we're supposed to be achieving collectively and as individuals? Societies set up for their members goals to aspire to. Integration. Societies must engender social solidarity and belonging among their members. Another important characteristic of any functioning society is achieving social integration, which is a sense of belonging. And out of that sense of collective belonging, there's a sense of a bond between you and others that you share your civilization with, share your society with. And then lastly, latent pattern maintenance. Societies must motivate their members through common values. Again, that involves achieving consensus, which is done through the cultural system. So each subsystem must handle these same four survival problems. I call them functional imperatives, but here it's referred to as survival problems. Meaning if these things aren't achieved, we see the dissolution of the group. The family, we can take this all the way down to the level of the family. The family has problems of adaptation. So economic maintenance, the parents are tasked with providing for the rest of the family, providing shelter, providing clothing, providing food, providing comfort at a bare minimum. There's also goal attainment for the family, making major decisions. Integration would involve coordinating family relationships. And pattern maintenance in the context of the family would be transmitting family values to children. So that there once again, you can arrive through the process of socializing children, can arrive at a complementary expectation between the values of the children and the values of the parents. And to wrap Parsons up here before we get to Merton, much of Parsons' theorizing aimed to provide, as we've been discussing, the conceptual foundations to legislate a set of concepts and explanatory logics for the human sciences. Some felt, and one of these individuals was Robert Merton, that Parsons didn't do enough to formulate, as we talked about last week, theories that are falsifiable based on empirical data. That really what's sort of falsifiable here is not really formulated in a way to falsify it. As I said on Tuesday, what is Parsons doing? It is an important part of scientific enterprise. He's naming things. He's classifying things. He's identifying systems. But at the end of the day, he's really just categorizing as a taxonomist who's categorizing the whole of society. But he believes that's important. It is important so that you and I, when we analyze society, we don't have to invent the language from scratch. We'll know what to name something, know what to call something. We can identify it there. It's a concept. It can be isolated from other things, and we can study it as a feature of empirical reality. His aim was to lay bare the most abstract, and boy, this is abstract, elementary and universal aspects of social processes. So much so that even any human action is argued to contain four universal features. And it's purged of, and for a lot of people I feel like dislike. I mean, here's quite the rupture between classical sociological theory and contemporary sociological theory. So much of classical sociological theory is steeped in a historical narrative. Parsons wants to do away with that historical narrative. No, it doesn't matter what we're studying, whether we're studying something that happened 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or yesterday. All of these concepts are valid, and these logical frameworks, these theoretical frameworks can be applied to any form of action, regardless of historical context. So it is meta. It is meta. It is a meta-theoretical framework that is meant to classify, capture the totality of social reality. Right? And some people hate this style of theorizing, and some people, such as me, tolerate it. Where it's like, hey, hats off. That's not an easy thing to do. To identify the four universal features of any action, and to identify the three systems and need dispositions and value orientations, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's quite impressive that he was able to capture, to systematize so much, or as what Weber would say, rationalize the study of society to that extent. Okay, well, let's turn the page. Let's get to Robert Merton. Robert Merton's a little bit lighter here. I think it will, next week is challenging in its own way, but I think it's more relatable next week on the critical theorists. I think it's more relatable. It's the Parsonian theory is just so general, it's so abstract, it seems so removed. There is relevance, but it takes a little bit more cognitive energy to make the connections. Well, let's get to Robert Merton, who was a student of Talcott Parsons. In contrast to Parsons, who sought, as we just discussed, to delineate a highly abstract master conceptual schema, Merton favored what he called middle range theory. So once again, Parsons is just, he's there. He's there for 30 years. And he's either there for a sociologist to set up this, to establish the appropriate mold for how to carry out being a professional sociologist, how to do research as a professional. So, but then you have even those that were students of Parsons that pushed back and said, I get it, you're developing an abstract master conceptual schema, but I think we should do things differently. So Merton was one of those that sort of borrowed some important ideas from Parsons, but also broke from Parsons and developed middle range theory. That involves abstractions, but that they are close enough to observe data that it allows us to empirically test those hypotheses, to test those theories. Because how do you test these three systems? The social, the cultural, and the personality. How do you test the pattern variable? How do you test the unit act? There are concepts that aid us in analysis, but they're not really theories. It's a framework. So Merton breaks from Parsons and says, well, I actually want to come up and formulate theories that I can test, that are close enough to empirical data, that they're not so abstract, they're not so removed. Theories of the middle range is what he calls. The middle range theories are contrasted with Parsons' grand theories, which Merton believed to be too remote from particular categories of social behavior. It's a particular approach, that is theories of middle range, to theory construction aimed at developing empirically testable hypotheses. So we're descending from the heavens a bit, we're coming closer to Earth. They're bounded by subject matter, Merton tells us. They're constituted from propositions containing observables. They are high. This is something that we talked about last week. High on a falsifiability scale, meaning to say a hypothesis is falsifiable is simply say it can be proven wrong. So it has to be formulated in such a way that it can be proven wrong. Something is more likely to occur, less likely to occur. Or it's actually quite Durkheimian. Durkheim, in fact, did a very good job at formulating, he didn't call it middle range theories, but his argument was suicide is most likely to occur under these social conditions. That we will see an increase of suicides when we identify a set of social conditions as anomic. That's falsifiable. It can be proven wrong. It can be proven right, but you can also maybe identify a situation or context in which it qualifies as being anomic, but we don't see an increase in the level of suicides. But Durkheim actually was good at developing falsifiable hypotheses. So Merton studied reference groups, he studied role conflict, which I briefly discussed on Tuesday. He studied social mobility and deviant behavior, so strain theory. Strain theory is one of many theories of sociological theories of deviance. Why do people engage in non-conforming deviant behavior? And there are at least 4 sociological theories that are used to explain why people engage in deviant behavior. I mean, why? And that's what any good theory would do. Any good theory would provide us an explanation for why we're seeing a particular type of behavior that is a deviant behavior that's considered deviant. Before we get to strain theory, though, we want to talk, and these are very popular concepts among sociologists even today, manifest functions and latent functions. We need to distinguish between the two. What are manifest functions? What are latent functions? And then we'll get to, and how are these different from dysfunctions? Because we have 2 types of functions, but then we also have the category of dysfunction. Manifest functions refer to those positive effects that are brought about consciously and purposefully. So positive effects that are brought. So if we're using the language of function, if we're using the word function, then that implies a positive outcome, which stands in contrast with dysfunction, which implies something negative, a negative outcome. But in terms of manifest function, latent function, a manifest function is the intended function. It's the intended function. Say the intended function of an educational institution is to transmit specialized knowledge so that you can help run the major institutions of a society. It's a manifest function of institution. The whole point of institution is, the institution of education is to transmit knowledge. Latent functions also refer to positive consequences, but these are unintended. These are often implicit and hidden. So the example that is provided in the reading involves the Hopi rain dance. This is what reaffirms group identity. So that would be the latent function. The idea is that the rain dance, the manifest function of the rain dance, is this ritual, it's believed, will bring about rain, which is then will feed the crops, yield more, a greater harvest, etc., and help avoid scarcity through abundance. The manifest function of the rain dance is to bring about rain. The latent function of the rain dance is that it serves to reaffirm group identity. Through participation in that religious ritual, Durkheim would say, one experiences collective effervescence and feels a connection with other members of the community and strengthens the social solidarity. All rituals are supposed to do this. All rituals. That your graduation ceremony ritual is supposed to strengthen your connection between you and your alma mater in the university. Right? A marriage, the ritual of a marriage is meant to strengthen the bond between those two individuals. So all rituals function in some manifest and latent way of strengthening the bonds that exist between the people that are participating in that ritual. In extending Parsons' view of society as a system of interrelated parts, Merton emphasized that the components of the system may or may not be in sync. The various functions of a single component may not coincide. They might even conflict. So this is what brings us to the world of the dysfunctions, right? I mean, we can think of, gosh, looking back to the pandemic, what was the manifest function of socially isolating or socially distancing? What was the manifest function of closing public institutions? Well, from the narrow view of the physician, it's to prevent the spread of disease. That was the manifest function of those policies. Quite singularly obsessed with, we want to stop the spread of disease. So we're instituting policies that will optimize that outcome by reducing the spread of disease. But think of all the dysfunctions that came with that policy. All the unintended consequences. I knew it was going to happen. I said, oh no, they need to talk to a sociologist. Like, I get it from a purely biological, purely physical health standpoint, but there are other considerations here, folks, such as economics and finances and mental and emotional health and the necessity of social interaction and relationships that need to be maintained and can be difficult to be maintained remotely. So that policy, in my opinion, was made very narrowly. It was only considering reducing the spread of disease, but we've got other things to consider here. And so there were a lot of dysfunctions that occurred as a result of that policy. It was well meant, and we understood precisely why it was happening. But your generation, my generation, your generation, we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to dig ourselves out of the debt that was created during the pandemic. I mean, that's the reality. That's a serious dysfunction. It's a serious negative consequence of that policy, of shutting it all down. And then the government was effectively paying people not to work. That's another dysfunction. Why is somebody going to go to work if they're getting paid not to? The idea, of course, was well-meaning. Like, well, we want to make sure that people meet their most basic needs. But now you're tasked with how are you going to get people to go back to work if you're continuing to give them paychecks? The labor market is now tight again. It was loose for a very long time, precisely because people were living off stimulus checks. They could be picky and choosy as to what they want to work. Now it's tightened up. Now employers are saying, all right, we have the reins back. Now we get to decide. And more employers are saying, back to work, folks. Cutting down on those remote, working from home agreements. Right? Because different parts of a system might be at odds with each other, even functional institutions can produce dysfunctions or unintended consequences. So even functional medical institutions, the general surgeon, whatever, all these institutions, well-meaning, right? But can produce unintended consequences. Dysfunctions are consequences that are negative. So that's how we can distinguish them from functions. Functions manifest latent are always positive. Dysfunctions are negative, and they negatively affect the function of the system. Another example that was provided in the textbook: national borders are functional in a variety of ways. After 9/11, more stringent passport and border controls served the function of keeping out other potential foreign terrorists. However, it has become much more difficult for everyone to enter the United States. This is true not only for potential terrorists, but also for legitimate workers and business people. So one of the dysfunctions of tightening border security following 9/11 is that it meant that it was difficult for everybody to travel. Okay. Now we've got a couple minutes for this, so we'll get to Merton's theory of deviance. If you've ever taken a sociology of deviant behavior course, I've taught it once or twice in the past. If you've taken that course, you've already been introduced, I hope. If not, your instructor wasn't doing a very good job. You were introduced to strain theory, again, one of four main sociological theories of deviance. So what was this? And it was one of the first. It was one of the first explanations. Differential association theory came after that. Control theory came after that. In the 1930s, Merton's theory of deviant strain theory. Sociologists, what is meant by deviant behavior? How do sociologists define deviant behavior? Sociologists define deviant behavior as any behavior that departs from the range of conduct that is regarded as normal. So we would say deviant behavior by definition is non-conforming behavior. Deviance is behavior that deviates, and it deviates from the norm. So deviant behavior then would be abnormal behavior. It's different than normal behavior. It's abnormal. It's deviant. So the question that has long interested sociologists, Parsons had an interest in deviance. Emile Durkheim was one of the first sociologists of deviance. And the question that unites all of their research is the following: what causes individuals to engage in non-conforming behavior? Why do people engage in deviant behavior? We have to explain it. We have to account for it. And Merton provided us with one of the first explanations of why people would engage in deviant behavior. Following the functionalist notion that society is a system of interrelated parts, going back to the first few slides of Tuesday, Merton hypothesized that deviance results when there is a disconnect. When there is a disconnect between the cultural and the social realms. I'm going to break that down for you in the following way. Between cultural goals that are set for us by society to strive toward, and the legitimate institutional means that are available to us for achieving those cultural goals. So Merton's argument is that there can be a society in which you have a disconnect between the legitimate institutional means that are available to a person and the achievement of cultural goals. This faulty relationship, he argues, has negative consequences. While every society offers its members cultural goals and two legitimate institutional means, the structure of society is such that not everyone has the same opportunities to be successful. That there may be a lack of accessible, legitimate institutional means for achieving cultural goals. And it's that disconnect that produces strain. So you can say maybe it's not one of your cultural goals, but it has long been one of my cultural goals, is to be a homeowner. Right? After spending so many years renting and renting and renting, the problem with renting, of course, is that you're never building equity. You spend $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month, and that simply pays for 1 month, and poof, it's all gone. And you are not able to take that money and invest that into a property that can help you build equity. So one reason why home ownership is so attractive to people is because over a period of time, 25, 30 years, all those mortgage payments add up to the ownership of a home that has a market value of a certain amount of money. All right, and let's say, I think right now the average cost of a home in Los Angeles County is somewhere around $600,000, so it's probably around there. Well, let's say you have one of your cultural aspirations, ownership aspirations, is that of owning a home. But let's say you make minimum wage. And you start doing the numbers and go, well, wait a minute. $12, $13 an hour, and I got to come up, if you want to even contend for purchasing a house, because it's a competitive process, you're going to be competing with other people that also want to buy the house. You're going to have to have at least 20% of that $650,000 in cash. So you go, how long is it going to take me making minimum wage to come up with that 20% that I can put down on a house? And you do that, you run the numbers, and you go, oh my goodness, that's a long time. That could be 30 years until I save up the money, or 40 years until I save up the money to come up with 20% to buy a house. That produces strain. and you say, I know where I can come up with $75,000. I can rob a bank. So Merton is telling us then that it's a feeling that deviant behavior can be caused by a feeling of frustration due to that structural pressure, which is, I want what other people want, which is to be a homeowner, but I'm making minimum wage. It's going to take me 40 years to save up 20%. That frustration, that strain can motivate, cause somebody then to engage in, say, deviant criminal behavior in order to get what they want. Or another example that's often, they've done these studies before over and over on students, that students are proficient in different subjects. The students that are least proficient in a subject are more likely to cheat. They're more likely to cheat because solving those problems or answering those questions is more difficult for them. So if you have extremely high aptitude and proficiency of a particular subject, you're less likely to cheat because you don't need the help. But if you find yourself in a class, say for me a mathematics class, where you have low aptitude and low proficiency when it comes to numbers, you're more likely to cheat. That you would be then motivated to engage in deviant behavior because of your low aptitude, say for mathematics. But that's the same idea. It's caused by frustration. Frustration produces the strain, and nonconformist behavior is called forth. So for Merton, deviant behavior is considered a normal response to structural strain. Okay, all right, so that's it, we're out of time. I'll post these slides. There's a couple other, I talk about the Davis and Moore hypothesis, so you may want to look at that. See you next week.
Thank you.
See ya. Bye. Hi. Hi. Okay.
I want to
You can go on the wait list, but the problem is that, oh, yeah, your phone. The problem is we're not issuing